Hello, everyone, and happy Tuesday. Hope you're doing well today. Every time I say happy Tuesday, the thing that pops into my mind is the old Popeye cartoon and the character Wimpy, who always used to say, I'd gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. I don't know why that pops into my mind, but yeah, it's weird. Anyway, hope you had a good Memorial Day weekend, and thank you for joining us for a daily devotional. You know, this summer marks a kind of big milestone for my family and I. We have been in Bloomington now for 15 years. Bloomington is far and away the place that I've lived the longest. And the longer I live here, the thing I appreciate about it is it makes that question, where are you from, easier. Now I just say Bloomington. Uh, until recently, that question drove me crazy because I didn't feel like I had a hometown. My family growing up, we moved around a lot. So I was born in Rochester and I lived there for 5 years. Moved to Jacksonville, Florida, lived there for 7 years. To Binghamton, New York, and lived there for 6, 7 years, something like that. And then off to college. So I was kind of around a lot and I don't feel like I have a hometown. Don't feel like I kind of truly am rooted anywhere. That sense of kind of wandering, drifting, not having deep roots in any one place, there's a sense in which that feeling ought to be true of all Christians. That we're not quite at home anywhere. No place truly feels like home because this isn't our home. It's our place of temporary residence, but not that place that we long for, not that place that we truly call home. The Apostle Paul talks about our citizenship being in heaven. Now, for the Apostle Paul, a Roman citizenship was a big deal. And he says we live here, but our citizenship is in heaven, in the city of God, not in this earthly city. Paul references that and he builds his ethic on that. But the Apostle Peter is the one who really drives that truth home, that we don't belong here. In his first epistle, First Peter, he begins that letter addressing it to God's elect who are exiles, or to the elect in the dispersion. They were God's chosen people, these churches that he was writing to, but he acknowledges that they're in exile. They aren't in their home. Though maybe they're residing in the city that they've been born in and lived in their whole life, they're still in a sense in exile. Throughout his letter, that theme keeps coming up. So just a little bit later in chapter 1, verse 17, he says, conduct yourselves with fear or reverence throughout the time of your exile. So this whole time that you're in exile, in other words, your whole life, live it with reverence, with fear to the Lord. In chapter 2, verse 11, he says, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which war against your soul. Here in this world that's not your home, you're aliens, you're strangers here. That's another translation of the same verse. You're aliens and strangers. There's things that are going to be warring against your soul. You're not truly at peace because you're not truly at home. You're exiles, aliens, strangers, pilgrims, sojourners. That's a truth that I know I've mentioned before in one of these daily devotionals, but I wanted to kind of dig down into it a little bit more. I think there's some really profound applications of that truth to the Christian life. And if you're anything like me right now, you're watching way more news, you're reading more newspapers, updates, articles, whatever. And the kind of the tentacles of this world can wrap around our hearts more as we're consumed with numbers and reopening plans and just all these things. So reminding ourselves of this truth that we're aliens, strangers, exiles in this world, I think is incredibly important. Let me draw out kind of three important, I guess I would call them applications of this theological truth. First, it's just, I'm just going to say it again as though it's application. This isn't our home. We need to let that sink in. Take a C.S. Lewis quote and put a spin on it. C.S. Lewis said that if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were created for another world. So take a spin on that. If everything in this world still leaves us feeling a little bit homesick, it's probably because this world isn't home. And if you feel homesick, if you feel not quite settled, that's okay. That's good. Because you're longing for the home that you were created for. You're longing for heaven. You're longing for the city of God where your citizenship is, where your life is hidden in Christ. I think there's a slight warning in that too, though. If you are perfectly at home in this world, what does that say about us if we're perfectly at home in this world? It probably says that we're not quite attuned enough to the other world. We're not having our affections, our thoughts, our imaginations transformed by the grace of God enough. And we need to open ourselves more to the work of the Spirit in our lives to tune us, to prepare us for heaven. So the first application is just to remember that this world isn't our home. And if you feel homesick, that's good. The second application has to do with how we read our Bibles. I think too often we as evangelicals identify with parts of the Old Testament that really we ought not identify with. We identify with Israel in the land. And really what we should be looking for is those places where the people of God didn't have a land. So Abraham, in his wandering, in his sojourning, when he left Ur of the Chaldees and went to a land that he didn't know and didn't have family and didn't have roots. We should be looking more to Joseph, who lived in exile, or to Israel in exile in Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Not to Israel as the nation settled in the land. That's not the church's model. That sometimes plays itself out when I see passages that we quote and take ownership of for ourselves. So, for example, I see often people quoting 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by name will humble themselves and pray, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sins, and I will heal their land. The problem is, we as the church who are called by God's name don't have a land. That promise in 2 Chronicles 7:14 wasn't for Abraham. He didn't have a land either. It wasn't for Joseph, who didn't have a land. It wasn't for Jeremiah, who lived in exile in Babylon. It wasn't for Daniel, who was in Persia. That was specifically for Israel living in the land, under judges, under kings. But we, the church, are God's people, called by God's name, but we don't have a land. We're living in exile. Now, that doesn't mean we should not pray. Let me say that again, because that was like a double negative, I think. That doesn't mean we should not pray for the leaders of our land. We ought to. That leads me to my third kind of application point of this. We live not in our land. We're not in Jerusalem. We're in Babylon. We're in the land of exile. That doesn't mean we just say, forget this world around us and think only of the world to come. That's not the right biblical application. We ought to be working to improve our culture, our world, but we do it realistically. When Jeremiah was in Babylon, he taught the people to seek the good of the city, but he never tried to get them to turn Babylon into Jerusalem. It was never going to turn into the city of God. It was never going to be transformed into heaven itself. They were always going to, while they were in exile in Babylon, be aliens and strangers. When we work to improve the city, we ought to do it realistically. We're not going to turn our nation, we're not going to turn the world around us into the kingdom of God, into the city of God, into Jerusalem. It will always be Babylon. And yet we ought to work to seek the good of the city. Jeremiah, who was living in exile, had told the people, we're going to be here a good long time. Put down roots. False prophets had come in and said, hey, don't settle. We're going to be here just temporarily. Just live in tents. God's going to restore us. Jeremiah warned the people, it's going to be a long time. So he says to the exiles who had settled in Babylon, Jeremiah 29, build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may have sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare. I think that's a very different model than, for example, citing 2 Chronicles 7:14. I'll heal your land. This is saying this isn't your land, but as the land you reside in as foreigners prospers, so you'll prosper. If it goes good for the city that you dwell in, it'll go good for you. So seek its welfare and pray for it. The world, the city, the nation that we live in isn't God's chosen land. But we reside here as aliens and strangers, and we ought to seek its good and pray for its good. I think that's a poignant reminder at this time that we ought to be praying for the pastors of churches that make decisions, for the mayors and governors of cities and states that make decisions, and obviously for the upper echelons of leadership in our nation, senators, congressmen, presidents. We ought to be praying together as the people of God for the welfare of our nation, our city. That's my thoughts on the truth, reflections on the truth that we're aliens and strangers. Remember, if you're homesick, that's good, because this isn't our home. Make sure that when you identify with the Old Testament, you're going back and identifying with the right parts of the Old Testament, drawing applications from those parts, and work together as the people of God for the good of the city that we live in. We do look forward very much to being together again. If you were watching the live stream on Sunday, you saw that we announced June 7th will be our first in-person gathering again for worship. We do have limited seating available for that. We want to maintain the distancing requirements and do this as safely and responsibly as we can. So we are not asking, we're requiring that if you're planning on coming on June 7th, that you go to our website, eccbloomington.org, and sign up to be a part of the service. If you get a message that the service is full, please add your name to the wait list that is also on the homepage. That'll help us plan for the future and how many services we need to be thinking about. We want to be as accommodating as we can, but please also know that just bear with us. This is a new thing for all of us, and we're trying to figure it out. We appreciate your patience through all this. We appreciate your support. And if there's anything we can do to be praying for you more specifically, or needs that we can be helping you with, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. Love you all, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.